Hi, and welcome to today's video. I have made this mood blanket, and it's like a temperature blanket, but instead of temperatures for each day of the year, it's my mood. I've completed the whole blanket, but I want to add a backing to it. So I'm going to try to make a quilt. I have all the fabrics and the pattern I'm using all drawn out. So let's just get straight into it. Let's go! I was probably just starting to crochet this blanket that I decided to add a quilt to the back. I saw this quilt on Pinterest, and that image right there was what made me want to make a quilt for this blanket. I just wanted to make that, and can you blame me? Those cats are so adorable. I just want to make it and have it in my hands. Throughout last year, I collected these little squares of fabric from my local craft store. I think they're originally made for quilting, so like kinda perfect for this. And I'd always just buy them whenever they're on sale. And I got most of them from a buy 10 for $10 sale when the original price of each one was $5. So that's like a good amount of savings. I ended up having 40 of them, which was definitely enough. And all the squares have different patterns on them, except for one. Look, I just really like the pattern of it. Like, it's a balloon unicorn with balloon rainbows on it. I just had to have it twice, okay? Unicorns are my weakness, okay? They are so cute. I did look at other designs before committing to the cats, and I did find this butterfly square design. I was going to have the butterfly design and this flower design just checkered on the blanket, and I didn't end up using it. The fabrics that I bought are all patterned, and I had no solid colors, which wasn't going to work for this butterfly design, so I had to go with the cats. With tracing the patterns, I did use a pencil to trace the sort of inner corners of the cats, because when you fold them, if you don't sew them like exactly, then those lines can kind of peek out a little bit if they've bled through to the other side of the fabric. But I also wanted dark lines so I can actually see, but I didn't want to use those disappearing markers, which I do have, because they disappear too fast, and I knew this blanket would take me a while to complete, and I didn't want the lines to disappear before I can work on it. So it felt like the pencil was a good idea. And for the rest of the lines, I used this black texture. It made it easy to see. Kind of worked with the darker fabrics, but not quite, but I did my best. As well as finding the picture of the blanket on Pinterest, I also found the pattern, which made stuff so much easier because I didn't have to figure out how to do the pattern on my own. At least I had a starting point. And yes, a starting point, because the pattern wanted you to make the cat in all sorts of different pieces, different triangles, different squares, and put them together, which I didn't want to do because it will create seams, and I didn't want seams. I just wanted the pattern on the fabric to flow throughout the cats and not have any hard seams cutting off the pattern in weird spots. So what I did was I took the pattern from Pinterest and ignored where they told me to put the seams and just made it all in one piece. And also to the pattern I added seam allowance. I did 2 centimeter seam allowance. I did make some practice cats with some scrap fabric beforehand, just so I can get used to the pattern and see what's right and what's wrong with it and how it's all going to come together, and just something to experiment with. And through that experiment, I figured out I needed to cut the corners of the seam allowance so that in the end the seams would lie a lot flatter and a lot better than if they were just in their full. I have previously kind of made a quilt before. I tried to do this like patchwork sort of jacket before using the same small quilting fabric that I'm using now to make that, but it didn't really work out. It wasn't the best. It just wasn't good. I didn't really know what I was doing. So kind of learning from that and a few other sewing projects I've kind of done in the past, I wanted all of them to have the same length of seam allowance, so I could just line up that seam allowance. And on the sewing machine it has little measuring thing, so I made sure that it lined up with the 2 centimeter, so it all just line up nicely and just be a lot more easier than just tracing out the cats and doing random numbers for seam allowance. Just it was, yeah, a little bit easier. All the cats have been cut out. Here they are. Oh, they're so cute. I love all the patterns. And as I was cutting all these out, I made sure to collect all the scraps. Here are all the bigger ones from when I was roughly cutting them out. And here are the smaller, more annoying ones to clean up. I shall add these to my scraps collection to become stuffing. And these to my bigger fabric scraps collection for a future project. Now, it's time to get sewing. So after cutting out the cats, I am left with this good old stack of cats. And I do have them in a sort of color order so I can keep track of all of them, because believe it or not, I do have a pattern of where all the fabrics are going, just to make it a little bit more easier on myself. Also to make it easier on myself when I'm sewing together the strips, I put them into their piles, and then afterwards, this was off camera because of course I didn't record it, I put them in order of when they come in the strip. I'm so good at explaining this stuff. I'm like A+ amazeballs at this. Sewing these cats together was kinda hard. The ears were the hardest part because you had to stop, realign the fabric each time. That was probably why the original pattern had separate pieces that then you would sew together. Seems like that would be a lot easier than what I did. I also had to make sure that the point of the ear didn't have any fabric edges popping out. At first, I struggled to keep the fabric from popping out, but as I went, I got more and more practice and I kind of got better. It was still a struggle, but a slightly less of a struggle. I'm gonna add some decorative stitching over it in the end anyways, so it doesn't matter too much. I have sewn all the strips together. They are very long. I've measured them on the mood blanket and they are a little bit long, but nothing that an old-fashioned crochet border can't fix. Right? Okay, let's finish sewing this thing together. Finally, something a little bit more easier. I think you can imagine that this part, sewing the columns together, is a lot more easier than actually sewing the cats into columns. Because sewing the cats into columns, you had ears to worry about. Sewing these columns together, you just have to do it in a straight line, and it's so much easier. Because it is a blanket and it is quite big, I didn't want to become overwhelmed with how big it is, sewing them together one by one. Like sewing the first column to the second column, and then adding on the third column and adding on the fourth and blah blah blah. I decided to sew 2 columns together at a time, and then once those columns sewn together, I'll take 2 of those columns and sew them together, and then sewing those parts together, and then finally being done. Even though this is very easy to sew together, it was just one big long strip, and it felt like it took forever to sew just one strip together. It was so long. And as I started sewing more and more columns together, it started getting wider and wider. I did clear my desk, so I had nothing on it, so I could just lay the fabric on my desk as I sewed, so it wasn't too bad. It's gonna get even harder when I have to lay it down flat, adding in the decorative stitches, which will come later. I am finally done. Kind of. It's so big. As cute as it looks, the seams are kind of rough. I have to iron all of them down immediately. Like, look at this. We shall not have this. We need to iron these down. Let's go iron them now. I finally ironed those nasty seams down. It wasn't too bad. I have had worse, like having to sew around those stupid ears. And after a while, I conquered those seams to lay down flat so that they will look nice. I went over all the seams, which was absolutely not frustrating to have to do all those ears again. There was something else that made it even more of a struggle. The size of the blanket. I was doing these decorative stitches after I sewed the whole blanket together. So as I sewed the details on, one side would be fine, the other side would just crumple up, and it would just be really hard to be able to move the fabric, and it was To somewhat help with this, I sewed half the decorative stitches on one side of the fabric, then turned the whole thing over and started on the other side to do the rest of the decorative stitches, so that it was only half the blanket that was being scrunched up next to the sewing machine at a time. And of course, the more easier part, those straight up and down seams, were so easy. So was it fun doing the decorative seams? It was kind of. I got to be creative, choosing the colored threads and doing different stitches on them, but it was hard work to do. And finally, this quilt was all done. All I had to do was attach it to the blanket. The quilt ended up being a little bit bigger than the blanket. Whoops, my bad. Crochet blankets can stretch, so it's not too bad. But before I can sew the blankets together, I still had leftovers of the colors that I used in the blanket. So using those, I went around the edges and just cleaned them up using a single crochet. The shorter sides, I used one color, but for the longer size, I used 2 colors. So it looks cool, right? Right? It looks cool? Please tell me it looks cool. After adding those single crochets around the whole blanket, now it is time to sew it together. At first, I thought I was going to sew them good side to good side and then flip it around and have like a nice clean edge. But I didn't end up doing that. I just folded the seam over on the quilted blanket and sewed it together, wrong sides facing together. And because I'm working with wool and fabric, I had to choose my sewing needle very carefully, but also not that carefully. I needed a sewing needle that was thick enough to be able to thread wool through, but also thin enough so it didn't create a huge hole in the fabric, and also sharp enough to go through the fabric, which I found this embroidery needle and it worked pretty well, and I had kind of a good time. Kind of meaning the needle was fine, but the blanket is very big. Anyways, we have finished sewing the blanket together and it's time to see how this blanket turned out. So finished. I love the crochet blanket. It looks really cool. And the quilted side isn't too bad either. The quilted side is still bigger than the crochet side. Just gonna have to deal with it because I don't want to take it all apart and add another border part. And also the blanket should stretch out over time, so let's just hope it does. Also, it like separates a lot because they're not like attached to each other. Don't love that, but I'm also gonna have to deal with it or just figure out how to fix it. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you liked it and I hope you like the finished product, the finished blanket. If you did, give this video a like, subscribe to see more stuff that I make in the future because cool stuff is coming, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye!